Right, a warm welcome from Geneva, Switzerland. My name is Reda Sadki. I lead the Geneva Learning Foundation, a new organization and a new kind of organization created in 2016, just under 4 years ago. Today is going to be a kind of exploration. I'm going to be trying to share for the first time some of the findings, some of the insights gained from the over the last few years of very singular research and developments and focus that we've had at the Geneva Learning Foundation. Don't know if any of you are familiar with Ada Twist's Scientist. It's a children's story of a little girl who asks a lot of questions. And I think if you are a learning leader today, you are necessarily asking quite existential and quite difficult questions. Some of the ones that are of concern to me, you can see here. I would invite you to type those questions, your own questions, into the chat if you'd like to participate. Digital scholar and the way we the line that connects the different dots, I'm going to be putting on the map, putting down, and challenging you a little bit to follow along. Looks like this. What would it look like as a kind of linear package with, despite the many moving parts? These are the things that I would say go into at least some of the things that learning leaders should be thinking about when thinking about our identity, our role, what difference we can actually make. In 2016, we created the Geneva Learning Foundation with other learning leaders, humanitarians, people working in global health and development, because we realized that there was a need for research and development, for meaningful innovation to help us tackle the challenges of our times. Now, as to me personally, that's me in the middle. You can see the rest of my family. I've spent my entire lifetime working on the edge of chaos. I've been a community organizer, a journalist, an educator, always working to make change. And that's been key to my journey and has led me to the Geneva Learning Foundation. And what I'm going to share with you today, in a way, is the outcome of the last 4 years of research and development we've been doing at the foundation, but more so also, the last 20 years or so of experience where I have spent my lifetime doing things that were not being taught anywhere. And I'm hoping that singular journey will make some sense to you and that you'll see some relevance. One key question that I came to is around the economy of effort. It's both a question and it can also be a statement. And it was while working at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies that I was called in by an Undersecretary General who asked me if I could help him bring the Red Cross into the 21st century. And at the time, the Red Cross had over 13 million volunteers working in 189 countries. And this senior leader in the Red Cross, basically said that we had 100,000 Swiss francs of budget and 4 people to take on the learning needs, to respond to the learning needs of those 13 million people. That's obviously why and when I became very interested in questions around education at scale, and this happened to be right around the, at least a sort of the hype phase of the MOOC, massive open online course movement. And that led me to then identify 5 organizational problems that actually were not being addressed by learning initiatives, even though they were quite key from a strategic perspective for the organizations and for the change that they were striving to make. This is from Karen Watkins, one of the co-founders of the Geneva Learning Foundation. And I'm hoping that even though we'll explore, we'll go, hopefully not in circles, but we'll try to connect the dots in today's presentation. So with the Geneva Learning Foundation, when we kicked off in 2016, we immediately launched 3 pilots. The first one was our own digital scholar course. And this was a 6-week journey for learning leaders to adapt their practices in the digital age, even though we were a brand new organization, over 1,000 people joined. It's quite amazing, quite remarkable. And some program graduates with no experience have since become digital learning leaders. The second pilot was called Ambulance, and this was around the healthcare and danger issue, which is about health workers being confronted with growing violence and not really open questions. How can they improve preparedness, response, prevention? Over 5,000 frontline community staff and volunteers from 110 countries, including 200 people working inside Syria, joined these exercises, developed in partnership with the Norwegian Red Cross and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, to document incidents of violence faced by health workers and to foster peer learning on that basis. We observed change in preparedness, thinking and practice to face the threat of violence, and got people to connect to each other from all over the world. And by the third iteration, the learning initiative was led by frontline practitioners themselves. And some of the outcomes that we saw consistently were like this: I became mindful in new ways. And Christina is a very experienced senior emergency medicine practitioner, but this type of connectedness, this type of sharing, this type of learning led her to new insights and improved mindfulness. The third program is the Immunization Scholar Program, and that's the one I'm going to spend the most time on, because since 2016, that's where we've made remarkable progress above and beyond our own expectations. So we wanted to go from a theory of change, and we had some notions of what should go in there, and we wanted to see how far we could turn that into practice. In just 3 years, we built a network of 15,000 people, 15,000 practitioners in 90 countries. We ran 23 cohorts, up to 400 per cohort, a third from the district level, very high completion rates. I worked with the World Health Organization, and gradually we built a team and built a relationship and managed to grow some strengths. When this program was first evaluated, this was one of the key findings. We weren't just developing courses. In fact, the whole approach was the whole premise was, let's start thinking about what learning looks like beyond training, beyond that moment when there's a structured learning intervention. And we put together, out of this evaluation came evidence that, participants, whom we call scholars, because we began to call it the scholar package of interventions. It's not a learning management system. It's not, a platform, but it's a combination therapy of different approaches, different tools, and leadership and process that led to this very high level of use. In terms of what difference people could make with this approach, we found that people without any support could actually contribute to the most important indicator when it comes to immunization, which is reaching children who had previously been unreached. And furthermore, because this was entirely based on peer learning, we found in remarkable ways in which people were willing to connect to and support each other, and saw that actually the support provided by volunteers in the course could actually produce effects beyond our expectations once again after the course was finished. That's when we began to think, well, if people have been able to do so much without any support from us, what would it look like if we actually convene participants to come together after the course and developed, co-created an agenda for change? That led us to create the Impact Accelerator. I won't go into the details of the Impact Accelerator. It's a completely new systems way of thinking about learning for change, learning to lead change. And what I will show you is that what changed in 6 months was quite remarkable. We asked people to take their course project. This was project and problem-based learning in our package, and basically challenge them to look at their projects. Could they implement? Could they work with those projects and do something with them? And a remarkable number of people basically answered yes. And not only did they lead their individual projects, but most people in the Impact Accelerator chose to work and collaborate with others from their country while being connected to others throughout the world. So when we evaluated, we asked what was most valuable about this type of experience, very different from a course, which is about practice and which is field-based, which is about getting things done, which is about turning knowledge into action and ultimately impact. This is what they told us. We realized that we wanted to measure, and that the continuous data flow that was coming from the field was also flowing between countries, between people, trying to affect change. And indeed, this was not just about measurement or not just about learning outcomes, but this is about mobilization. And this some of the key pieces of feedback received consistently from participants in the accelerator. This is where we realized that what we built together with practitioners was actually a kind of human knowledge network, and it's a 21st or digital age equivalent of an alumni network. Alumni networks have always been significant for many reasons, but here we felt that we were leveraging that economy of effort to turn that pledge, had a moral dimension as well, to turn knowledge into action. So starting with a purely digital initiative, there was no face-to-face workshop, there was no travel accommodation. Participants did not receive any financial benefit, no per diem, to participate. So we knew that if they were involved, it was because they wanted to. We began to see something remarkable, is that from a purely digital initiative, people in countries began to meet together. The first time was actually in 2016, when I saw in a message online that some of the participants were organizing a breakfast in Nairobi, Kenya, and some were traveling hundreds of kilometers to join that breakfast. 3 years later, through the Impact Accelerator, people were gathering not only to have breakfast and to share a meal, but to actually map out how they could use what they had gained from these courses to make a difference. The concept of the accelerator, inspired some people to talk about doing better, but also going faster in order to meet the challenges in immunization and to reach the children who had not previously been reached. Nous sommes ensemble, we are together, became a kind of rallying cry for people who had shared this experience, had made a pledge to achieve impact, and began to work together. You can see many more pictures of the individuals involved, and we saw that from a purely digital initiative. There was no contradiction or no choice to make between physical and digital worlds, that the two were constantly crisscrossing and interpenetrating each other. So here we have some of the photos. In 2019, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation entrusted us with their initiative, their Teach to Reach initiative, which is about improving immunization training. And we are actually, the deadline has been extended, but we are now getting ready to launch this program, which aims to improve immunization training and to do it in a systems way to contribute to systemic change. Right now, there will be over 4,000 people. This will be by far the largest immunization training ever, but that's not the point. Scale is only one aspect. We've been able to achieve completion rates above 90% with some of the cohorts. So we realized as we built this package of interventions, the Scholar package, and saw these outcomes and experienced them and tried to process them and figure out, we realized that we could do all of these things with a purely digital approach. And then the next question, of course, being the Geneva Learning Foundation, was, can we teach others to do this? And we, of course, had, like any self-respecting learning person, had many different kinds of models. Some came from, this one is from Bill Cope and Mary Kalantzis from New Learning, about the affordances of digital learning. This one also from Bill Cope and Mary Kalantzis, describing the Scholar learning environment that we used. This one is from Karen Watkins, again, describing the learning culture framework. And this one from George Siemens, describing connectivism implementation cycle from his book, Knowing Knowledge in 2006. Sure, we had a lot of frameworks and used them as sort of multiple lenses to make sense of things. And then over time, we built actually quite an amazing team of people, a growing proportion of which are actually former participants in one or more of the programs. You can see Christina, the emergency medical doctor, and who is just about in the middle of that photo, for example. And there are other former scholar alumni who are part now of the team. Now, we had a very ambitious aims. We wanted to we would like to be able to offer all these things. And the reality is that we're not there yet. We're still light years away from providing something that can, sort of compete with the, the breadth and depth of the experiences that we have as human beings in the physical world. But what's important is not where we're at now, it's actually the rate of change. And the rate of change is very fast and getting faster. So again, we came back to these questions, just like Ada Twist, scientist, who asks so many questions. And we know that one of the things that's kind of prevalent, let's say, amongst people working in learning is asking questions about the future, and asking questions like these, what's the future of learning? Is it VR? Is it AI? Is it AR? Is it neuroscience, the blockchain? Every, learning consultant worth his or her salt will have their opinion on these. So I'd like to take a step back and actually suggest some caution here. So predicting the future, trying to guess what's going to happen next has always been challenging. And I think I'd like to do a top 10 countdown of the least reliable predictions. So for example, this one is from 1876. And this is someone at Western Union who says this telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication, inherently of no value. That's number 10. The Americans have need of the telephone, but we do not. We have plenty of messenger boys, and that was the British response at the time to the American telephone. Number 8, the wireless music box has no imaginable commercial value, and that was, of course, about radio. We don't like their sound, and guitar music is on the way out anyway. That's about the Beatles. Drill for oil, you're crazy. So that's in 1859. Who wants to hear actors talk? That's, one of the Warner Brothers says this in 1927. Television may be feasible, but commercially and financially, impossible. Lee DeForest. Number 3, it's about the Japanese auto industry. It's not going to carve out a big slice of the US market, and that's Business Week in 1968. Number 2, I traveled everywhere, talked with the best people. I assure you, data processing is a fad that won't last out the year. And my personal favorite at number 1, there's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home, and that's Ken Olsen, president, chairman, and founder of Digital Equipment Corporation, which no longer exists, and which in 1977 was still building and selling mainframes. So this calls for a lot of modesty about, to what extent we can predict, and to what extent we're able to know what is coming. But we do have some thinking about how we think about change that can actually help us navigate the unknowns and the uncertainty. Second point I want to make is actually, this is a presentation by Michael Moe at the Global Leadership Congress in 2013. These are his slides, and it's kind of a common trope in amongst sort of educational technologists or learning specialists to present things in this way. This is lighting 150 years ago, and this is lighting now. And you can see the contrast is stark, of course. This is medicine. It's a very gendered medicine 150 years ago, and medicine now. This is transportation back then, and this is transportation now, or probably tomorrow. This, I don't know if anyone can guess what this is. If you'd like to, type in your guess. What could this be with the vineyards? Yes, it is a vineyard, indeed, but it's actually Silicon Valley 150 years ago. This is communication then, and you can tell this slide is from 2012 because I think the icons that should be here have changed. And of course, the clincher in this kind of presentation from educational technologists is to then show a classroom 150 years ago and to say, look, there has been very little change. Why is change so difficult? And usually then it's to propose the next app or the next piece of technology that's supposed to revolutionize this. But I'd like to, again, take a step back. And this is not a classroom. This is the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a newsroom that no longer exists. I just noticed that Bem Joyner is checking in from Atlanta, so he may know about the Atlanta Constitution. So, question to ask is, if you had asked these journalists, who obviously knew and practiced their profession, what was going to happen to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and how things would go with what we call now digital transformation, this process of moving from one medium to another, which actually involves much broader changes. Do you believe that they would have been able to ascertain or predict, much less predict, what was going to happen and how things would go down? So that's where I'd like to suggest that before we start, we imagine that there could be like a Napster. So Napster with the record industry comes, is this app, what we call an app now, that comes out, and all of a sudden you can download all of the music you want for free. And many people are looking for the Napster for education. And there's a reason, there's several reasons, but I'm going to share one of them that I think is actually much more significant than we tend to think about why I don't think there can be a Napster for education. And that's really a point about education as the science of learning. This is from Bill Cope and Mary Colensis. The point is that education is how people come to know. And I believe that actually people who work in learning, education, or training are uniquely positioned, not just to come up with some learning solution, but to actually help us navigate the changes of this sweeping change that's coming through through the digital transformation. That's not just affecting education, but that's really transforming in profound ways our societies. And there's both at this stage, a dream and a nightmare. And there's a vision that's been around for a long time about digital learning or some kind of automated form of learning. There's also, this is from the Matrix, I'm going to try to play it. This is Neo, one of the main, or actually the main character, who's jacking in, plugging his brain into a machine that's going to teach him various kinds of skills in a few seconds. That he's then going to be able to use. We have a wholly different vision, which I'm going to try to increase here. And it's not really new, but the economy of effort, the changes, what we can afford to do, both literally and figuratively, has changed and is enabling us to do these things in very new ways to achieve different outcomes. One of the things is there's this perception that, and this opposition or dichotomy between digital and real, what many people call a virtual space, or digital space. And it's actually this guy, who I do not personally know. He's the philosopher in residence at Snapchat, or at least he was in 2012. And he had a way of describing what actually is happening, I believe, is that it's a kind of augmented reality where the digital and the physical are constantly interpenetrating. They are one thing, they're part of our experience, and there's no opposition or dichotomy. Yet that skepticism about digital, you can even sort of link it back to Plato's view of the written word, saying that writing was no more than an imitation of speech, while speech itself was an imitation of thought, and therefore not authentic, not real in a way. And this is actually an article from 1989 that sort of analyzes this at a time when digital meant basically bulletin board systems exchanging text messages through these systems, plugging into the even pre-internet with a modem or with various systems. So it's not, I think that as learning leaders, we need to sort of unpack and think through what this means and to learn to detect underlying assumptions that are rested in these kinds of convictions. One debate we can put to rest is this whole business of comparing face-to-face versus online. This is an absurd question now because digital is embedded in everything we do. So even someone who claims they love face-to-face is actually dependent on all kinds of digital technologies in order to ultimately corral people into a physical space to teach them. There's also another conviction. I don't know if I can ask this, given the accusation that's on my screen, but if you consider yourself a learning technologist, you may or may not like this, this next section. So my point is not to castigate learning technologists. I know many people, including the pioneers who 30 years ago or more, were already experimenting with using digital technologies, digital networks, to support, foster and actually practice learning. And there's some remarkable ways in which learning technologists, for example, in a university, will advise professors on choosing the right platform, and that will actually be part of a process to help professors pay attention to how they teach. And that in and of itself is quite remarkable. But overall, this is, I think the way that people working in learning technologies, myself included, are being swept away by this digital transformation. And so the question becomes, do we just wait to see what happens, or do we figure out how to harness and leverage this wider sweeping change and rethink our roles, not just about choosing platforms and tools, but actually how we can be part of help shape the changes that are ongoing in our societies. And so, the ways in which this is transforming us are much more profound than individuals or groups advocating the use of technology for learning as if it were an end unto itself. And really, we're in the middle of, now some people call it the second machine age, other people call it the fourth industrial revolution, but how could the role of education be limited to that? How could we not consider that education actually provides a philosophy for change? That's been our guiding principle, and I kicked off with some examples of where that has led us and how that change has actually been produced. And what we're chasing after is a generalizable model, and I think we're very close, which is why we decided to hold this event today, so that we could actually begin to share our findings and engage with other learning people, people with an interest in learning, education, and training, and an interest in change, to begin to engage and to foster a new kind of dialogue. So there's a question, I've been talking about change a lot. Here's some of the things that are changing. This is in 1978 in the National Basketball Association in the United States. If you were good enough to get into the NBA, you didn't train because you were that good. There's a coach who actually took one of the players and was doing decently, but performing not as well as he was expected to. And this was Kermit Washington. And Kermit Washington was trained through grueling workouts, schooled in the basics of footwork, positioning, and shooting. And the following season, he improved in every aspect of the game, and by the end of the decade, he'd become an all-star. Now, that was 1976. Some industries have yet to experience a performance revolution, but I'd like to give you one of the nice, more impressive examples. of what performance means in practice. And this is what we all wish for a team, for an organization, for a company, when affecting change, is for this kind of collaboration to take place. And I think that's changing, like what performance means, how we develop it, how we get there. I think that's one of the key changes we need to be paying attention to. Scale and access, I've already talked about the scale and access. Both of those are very important. The question of expertise, what is expertise? Who is an expert? How do we share expertise? In our world, experts tend, if they're good, they tend to be very busy, responding to disasters, responding to emergencies, and we have to figure out, it's a problem. Expertise becomes a kind of problem, and we need new ways, new models for expertise. Applicability is an old bugbear for learning and development. We know that people go to training and they're in a safe space, certainly, but then what do they do? How? Then they go back to work and they have to figure out what to do with what they did in the training. So I believe that through the Scholar package, through its use of problem and project-based learning, we found ways out of all of these dilemmas. Diversity is also often seen as a problem. If you'd like all your learners to be the same, so they can start from the same place and get to the same place. So productive diversity is part of the model. Complexity, this is aircraft carrier. A little bit of discomfort as a humanitarian when seeing this, but this is a 1998 study from Gene Rocklin and colleagues that showed that through essentially constant retraining and retraining, and despite intensive job rotation, something like an aircraft carrier could function as a high performance, high reliability organization. So when thinking about organizations that are struggling with complexity, it is possible to actually build performance and reliability, and we need to figure out how to do that. I think that's another one of the key challenges. These diagrams are from, again, George Siemens' Knowing Knowledge 2006 book, and I think one of the fundamental, there have been some things that have changed, and we've known about these changes now for decades, about the nature of knowledge. So we used to think of knowledge as a product, or as a reservoir, so a database, putting data into pigeonholes. And we now need to think about, what does that mean when knowledge is a river and a process? What does that change for how we learn, how we teach? This is from Robert Kelly. This longitudinal study is showing in 1986, if you're a knowledge worker, 75% of people, 75% of what you needed to know to do your job was actually right there in your brain. By 2006, that was down to 10%. So the relevance of leadership of networks is exemplified here, because if 90% of what you need is with someone else or with a machine, your ability to connect, the quality of the pipes that connect you to others may actually turn out to be more important than the knowledge itself, especially if the knowledge is constantly changing. In fact, one of the places where we saw this very clearly was during the Ebola crisis response in 2014 and 2015. And that's where there's realization, but also a paradox. Anna Patrick, writing in The Lancet, says it's about human resources and coordination, yet pretty much every recommendation following the thousands of lessons learned exercises during that Ebola crisis response, neglected to address HR, capacity building, leadership dimensions of the change that was needed. So some of the contradictions and some of the some of the issues are here. And then there's a key question: what's the value of course content in a world of content abundance? If by the time you structure your content into a curriculum, it's probably there's at least some parts of it that are no longer current. So how do you achieve currency when there's so much stuff online? What's going to be valuable there? That's another key question. So the opportunity is probably not in the content. So as learning leaders, what can we do? What is our role? And is there an opportunity? This is actually from a exchange on Twitter, stuff I pulled off and basically copied and pasted. There's a fascinating exchange over the course of a few hours, looking at how the education market is changing. And you may not work in higher education or in the university, but whether or not you do, this is kind of interesting to think about what these changes mean for where you are, what you do. There's some structural changes in the learning economy. and increasingly that sort of conventional norm of, at least in North America and Western Europe, of university of first and then a second degree, somewhere between 18 and 25 or 30 at the most. That's no longer the reality for most people. Now, the thing about lifelong learning, which sounds like we're going to be in school forever, but what does this mean for us? There's a complacency by established education providers. And I think that's where there's actually quite a significant opportunity in terms of how can we make a difference. If you're for the foundation, it may be if you're a company, how can we make money? And if you're a learning and development manager, how can I secure the support and attention of my senior management? So there's already some examples of where this transformation has already happened, and this is one of them. So data science people, more than half, develop their skills through massive open online courses or are self-taught. Don't have a degree and don't need one because of the particular job market for that industry. How do we meet the needs of new learners is another question. We need different ways of really thinking about credentials, shorter formats, but not badges. At least that's what I believe. And again, I welcome you to disagree with me in the chat or through using the Q&A. That's where the opportunity may be or should be, given in relation to these changes. And before, I'm going to show you like an example of a failure. An organization that have very ambitious aims to tackle and harness these changes, and that went belly up or and failed to do this. And I'm also going to show you a model which I built while doing 3 years of research on new business models for education, about how I think there is actually a way of turning the opportunity into an actual business model that can turn education from a cost center into an activity that can actually help support an organization, support and grow an organization. So in thinking about business models, many of us in learning are uncomfortable. We consider that our pursuit is higher than that because it is about knowledge and learning and the advancement of science. That's and in fact, the way universities are split up as kind of twin-headed institutions, where academics are not asked to think about budgets and the pipeline of students and the credentials, the financial value of a credential are all sorted out through various institutional mechanisms. One part of our singular experience is that starting from scratch, we haven't had that ability to rely on institutions. We're actually building the systems and are rethinking how we do it. The questions, though, remain the same. Wherever you're positioned and whatever type of education, learning, or training you're involved in, how do we reach the customer? And then, who is the learner? Are they actually the customer? That's and then what's the size of the pie? You can expect to attract 0.5% of the people interested in your topic. That's like a sort of rule of thumb to actually figure out if you can cover your costs at the price point that you select. How are you going to reach the learner and the customer, especially if they're different? How do you prioritize reaching the customer? Which customer? What's the relationship between learner and purchaser? And other considerations around segmentation, targeting, and positioning. So these are some of the, if you're going to develop a learning initiative, whether you're sitting inside an organization or in any kind of institution that doesn't already have systems in place to provide what you need, you're going to have to think about and give due consideration to these things. Now, I promised an impractical example of a business model that led the organization that initiated it, theorized it, to go belly up. This organization is called the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. It was created by Save the Children and received £20 million from the British government, and with matching funds from a private donor, and claimed to have a startup model. What was interesting about the Humanitarian Leadership Academy is they were built on research demonstrating the need for strengthened humanitarian leadership. The business case talked about sustainability and cost recovery from user fees and moving away from institutional donor funding, and yet at the same time recognized that this would not happen in the first 5 years. The theory of change underpinning their business model was that providing sustainable business models would lead to a humanitarian workforce with increased skills, and that and recognize that there were some gaps, some unknowns. However, on the question of who pays, there's the assumption that some would be willing to pay for the Academy's services, and that cost recovery would be derived from individuals, and that course fees could be recovered from participants as well as organizations. Now, there's a number of contradictions. Reading the business case is really interesting, especially given the outcome, with a financial contribution from SAVE, and within 5 years, their goal, very modest actually, was to recover 8% of costs through these, through their business model. The aim was to become self-sustaining at 8% and within 5 years. And yet, when it came to measurement, there's startlingly little about how they would track progress towards achievement of their own stated aims with respect to the business model. And so I speak about the Humanitarian Leadership Academy as a sympathetic observer. This is an organization whose development I have followed. I know many of the good people who've contributed to it. So this is by no means to scorn or diminish, but rather it's to point out how difficult it can be to build a sustainable business model, and how we need new ways of thinking and doing if we are hoping to achieve more than 8% recovery, and to actually build organizations that will help take us into the future, as long as learning and development remains a cost center. As long as learning remains an expenditure or is dependent on donor funding, it is unlikely to be driven by demand, and is unlikely to need to adapt and change in the ways that could be productive and actually make learning and development relevant in very different ways. So that's one case study. Here's an alternative model, which is about how an organization can build sustainable training. First of all, it needs to be based on demand and market analysis. There's no shortcut to that. So a lot of it is going to be contextual. And second, it's going to require an upfront investment. Third, is that if you fully leverage the new economy of effort, you can achieve sustainability, cost recovery, and profit by year 3, all right? Whatever it is called in your context. So just to map out some of the key points about the model, this is again based on 3 years of research on new business models for education, and it's a model I built while working with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. You have to start with €500,000. That's a significant amount of funding or money but it's an investment. That's the difference. By year 3, these are the earnings by the 3rd year in this model. So what are we selling with this model? And if you're uncomfortable as an educator or a learning specialist hearing about sales and product and sales and marketing, I think we need to get used to it, and I think we need to embrace that. Even if you work in an institution that shields you from the market reality, it is out there, and it is likely to lead to sudden and unexplainable change. In the case of the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, they did not close down, but they were brought back in to Save the Children to help cover their costs in the context of a larger organization. Who knows what could happen to your organization if you ignore the financial and economic dimension of learning, education, and training. So this model is based on not selling content, because we saw there's a glut of content abundance, but rather on recognizing that the value is provided by the certification, So certification is worth paying for if it can help you get a better job and get a promotion. That's in many ways what it's about. In terms of professional development, professional career development, that is one of the key drivers. Second, here is a budget over the first 3 years based on this model. And you can see here that in the first 2 years, you're in the red, but by year 3, you're actually generating more than the initial investment. And again, here you can see starting in year 0, this was built back in 2015, so 2016 would have been year 0. You don't need to invest everything up front. And you have over 2 million of annual expenditure by year 3. But in that year, you're actually generating far more as your earnings. So this is a simple example. It's basically addition and subtraction, figuring out what is the value of the certificate based on some market analysis. But I would claim that this model, which is one of the models we're going to focus on in the Digital Scholar program, is actually a good provide some good rule of thumbs for how you can do analysis in your own context and for your own needs. Now, if you work in an area where you're just assuming that training is going to come from a donor, the example of immunization is relevant here. Though international donors are increasingly reluctant to fund any kind of training because of limited return on investment and the difficulty to measure any actual kind of change. So there's also a cautionary tale there about if you're currently shielded from those market realities, you may not be in the future. And I think one of the few ways to survive and thrive in the future is going to be to harness that economy of effort and to harness what we can afford to do literally and figuratively by using these new ways and new approaches. So Digital Scholar is an education initiative to develop new skills in leadership for the digital transformation of learning. So if you consider, whether or not you consider yourself a learning leader, but if you're involved in organizing, preparing, delivering, evaluating, funding training, we'd like to provide basically in a structured pathway, 8 modules that include an apprenticeship or at the organizational level, a partnership to co-create a learning system based on some of the analysis and the principles adapted to a specific context. We would like to offer these 8 modules as a comprehensive package, probably over the course of a year or 2 years, with of course a lot of flexibility and a lot of adaptation. And in 2016, the first thing we did was to offer this course called Digital Scholar. People worked on, I would say, that design module. How do we develop meaningful learning? How do we think through that? And we now sort of fleshed out what the rest of the curriculum looked like, but a very new kind of curriculum and a very different kind of curriculum. So that's my presentation for today. I know I've meandered and navigated over many different kinds of topics, but I'm hoping that, and actually reason to hold the event is to actually grapple with and get a sense of whether there are other people out there who are thinking about business models for education, who are thinking about what the digital transformation means for us and what the future of learning actually might look like. So that's why I'm looking forward to the last 13 minutes. And I'm going to look at the Q&A now. I've been keeping an eye on the chat. So Abdi Mohammed, who says, knowledge is a river, not a reservoir. Good takeaway from the presentation. Yes, fully agree. And Julie says, this is precisely my need right now to build a sustainable system for learning in my organization. Maybe we could hear from Julie. Let's hear. Julie, I've taken the liberty of opening up your microphone. You'll need to unmute before
yes,
we can hear you.
Myself. Can you hear me?
All right. Yes. Could you introduce yourself and tell us
yes. Hi,
more?
Reda. Hi, everyone. My name is Julie. I'm the Digital Learning Manager and an international organization based in France. And Reda, I would like to thank you very much for this extremely interesting presentation. So this, you actually covered all my questions and needs. I was not expecting that, so it's a very, very good surprise. And I think that everything that you've been saying is utterly relevant, especially the fact the donors chasing and how we build training projects more on an ad hoc basis rather than in view to sustainably build knowledge and experts networks. So I really look forward to continuing this exchange and maybe to take on those 8 modules. I would be interested in knowing also the how will you build that? When will it be available? And every details regarding this program, or are you building it right now and asking for contributions? That's my question.
All right, thank you. That's a great question, and we wanted to know if this would connect with the needs of anyone out there. So thank you for that validation. In response to your question, so we have a particular way to design which is completely interactive. So the inaugural time when we do a learning intervention or a course, we're building every day. We're building on a daily basis in response to the learner signals. And that's actually the second module of what we call analysis, to actually figure out what learners are telling us and build a fully adaptive system. The cool thing is we do that once, and then it tends to work for the successive cohorts, such as the 23 that we've organized with the World Health Organization. So to answer your question now, we're going to use that approach in the coming months. We're going to, so people who've attended this session, and we had over 350 people register and an impressive turnout. So you'll be hearing back from me and back from the Geneva Learning Foundation about the next steps, and we're definitely going to put together a structured, hopefully coherent offering, and are very interested in discussing the needs of organizations and learning leaders who share our interest in just finding better ways to learn and to make our learning interventions relevant and useful to the missions that we serve. I see a nice comment from Daniel Glintz. I have to, yes, Daniel, I hope you've written in the chat 132 slides to end with an advertisement. You must be kidding. Would love to know who you are and hear more about, we are not, we are a nonprofit based in Geneva, Switzerland. We actually don't have anything to sell. So I'd love to hear from you, Daniel, if you're willing to explain further your comment. All right, Daniel, are you able to speak to us? I've unmuted you, but you also need to unmute yourself. It looks like you've done that.
I have been a learning manager for the past 10 years or 20.
Okay, nice to meet you, Daniel. Yes, any additional feedback or comment on the on today's presentation? Okay, it sounds, I'm hearing background noise, but all right. Let's see. So I see many questions in the chat and time running out as well as in the Q&A. So let me try to run through the easy ones to answer. So from Abubakar Shuaibu, can I get all the presentations? So answer is yes. The presentation will be shared with all of the participants as well as some additional resources. From Mary Julek at the IRC, I'd love to know more about what you think an entity like the HLA, the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, should or could have done differently in order to be successful. So that's a really good question, Mary. I think when I looked at, I analyzed that business case, there's like the, you need to get the marketing and the strategy right from the outset. There's some key lessons we've found and learned over the years, to guide us in terms of not focusing so much on the technical dimension of training or not focusing solely on one aspect. I think HLA primarily focused on scale and delivered a lot of click-through e-learning modules with low efficacy. We know that as well from research and evidence. And so, yeah, there's lots of things. It's a complex question. What we know is that it's important to track such initiatives. There's another one called Humanitarian U that was recently basically acquired by a corporate learning management system provider. Again, because I suspect they couldn't get the financials right. But there's also many other things. It's not a defeatist, observation. It's on the contrary. There's so many things. There's so many opportunities that they could have seized, especially when you start with 20 million pounds out of the gate and matching funds from another donor. I hope I have answered your question. Please raise your hand if you Mary, if you'd like to comment, if you have further questions. Okay, another question from Mary about stackable credentials versus digital badging. So I'm a skeptic on badges, but from discussions many years ago, Philip Schmidt from the MIT Media Lab and originally from the University, I forget exactly what it was called, but at the time wrote one of the original concept papers about digital badges, and at the time he managed to convince me that they could be relevant. I just haven't seen any. I mean, maybe I haven't seen them, but I haven't seen any effective use. And I know there's some efforts such as HBAS in the humanitarian space to use them. So I much more believe in stackable credentials where the validation, the accreditation comes from potential employers and other stakeholders. What that looks like in a particular context is going to be very different, but that's kind of what I would believe in. Given the quality and the number of questions, I'm quite willing to stay over time, and I'm actually very much enjoying this, of course. So let me see what else we've got. So so from Anne, I say some developing countries in Africa like Kenya, my country is struggling to meet expensive technology in schools. Can you give some ways of how they can get some assistance? So the one area where the Geneva Learning Foundation doesn't really have a program is on K through 12 education. So I believe you're talking about children's education from kindergarten to 12th grade in the sort of Anglo-Saxon system. So I don't think I can be helpful there. However, there are there are organizations specialized in this area. And of course, there's a legacy of sort of technology in schools gone wrong, as well as examples of technology done in useful ways. So I don't think I can really answer that one. Digital. Okay, a question from My Beatus. You mentioned a digital solution. Are you building a solution or training? So I think what we're building is something new. It's a combination of platform, technology, process, talent, and context. So I don't even know. I don't think there's a term for it. There's sort of a traditional opposition between product or process. I think we do both. So it's really a hybrid in many ways. Basically, we call it a package because we put all the ingredients that it took to actually make it work and produce some of these outcomes. All right. An anonymous attendee who asks, I was wondering how this model applies in low resource settings like organizations or individuals who exist in the grassroots level. So yeah, very good question. Most of these, so the technology, there's a lot of free stuff out there, which calls for caution, of course, because if you're not paying for it, then you're probably the product. But nevertheless, they're like really smart, clever ways of leveraging digital learning technologies and sort of connections between people to work, to sort of promote and foster change at the grassroots. You saw the pictures of the scholars working on immunization together in countries. Yeah, we know that there's so many ways to do things, and it's more about figuring out how, and that's part of the foundation's mission is sort of figuring out the how, and to do it at low cost, because almost all the projects we do are actually are actually addressing the needs of developing countries. All right, so from Mary, again from IRC, thank you, Mary, for so many great questions. Would love to engage more on all these topics and partner where it's useful. It's very timely for the IRC as we're currently thinking about how to completely innovate how our staff around the world work. So I think one of the opportunities is that if you're responsible for learning development because of the economy of effort, you could only address the staff. And if you're lucky, not just a few senior managers, but the rank and file. I think one of the changes is that now it's actually more interesting to think about, and I think IRC is already involved in refugee education efforts, is to think about both the clients, beneficiaries, customers, partners, yes, they're going to be called different things depending on the context, as being part of the system that where you can contribute to change through a learning intervention. But there's still many challenges. One of them being, if you're the learning and development manager, you're not being paid to think about how you could connect people in the field, say people in refugee communities, with staff in order to improve, localize, progress dialogue, and so on. A question from Iris Isiptan. So Iris is a digital scholar alumnus from 2016 and a remarkable learning leader. I encourage you to follow her on Twitter. Iris, if you could type your Twitter in, I think it will be of interest to many. She's based in the Philippines. She's actually a medical doctor who's been promoting the use of social media and sort of innovative learning technologies. She asks, how can I convince my university to try a flexible and adaptive format as I experienced with you in Digital Scholar? So first of all, thank you. It was an honor to work alongside you as well. And I think that's why we have that leadership module. So I'm not saying take the leadership module, that's not the answer, but that learning leadership in practice is, okay, so once you've understood these things for yourself, how do you go about convincing others? And how do you sort of negotiate with a system, with your environment, with your institution, wherever you are? There are going to be some constraints, some challenges, some opposition, and how you do that. And I think there we have a lot to learn from each other, because many people have been successfully advocating for change. One obvious example is with the current threat of a coronavirus pandemic. That is likely to provoke a profound shift in how we work, how we live, how we care for each other. And I think in that crisis, there's also perhaps this is the right time, if you work on distance learning in many countries, all of a sudden this question of distance learning is coming to the fore, and people are realizing that they're only driving to work or driving to school out of convention, despite the many challenges required to improve digital learning. So maybe, that's one of the things where we're hoping that by thinking together, by sharing our context across borders in these new ways, with hundreds or thousands of people participating, that we can actually support each other in leading that change. Question from Peggy Lynn McIsaac, the 0.5% rule, moment to explain it a bit more. That's actually from Chris Deedy from at Harvard's College of Education, who was making a point in a conference about, so I know there is a source for that 0.5% of the as the sort of proportion of the market. I can share the presentation. I can share his presentation or point you to it after this. And also a pleasure to see you again, Peggy Lynn. All right, Mike wants to know what tools were used to build and deliver the learning. So we're pretty agnostic about tools and platforms. Basically, we use whatever works at a particular point in time. And instead of saying, well, let's find the best platform, this is when people would sort of spend months agonizing over which learning management system should they purchase. We try to make sure that actually what we do is platform independent. So in the simplest, lowest common denominator formats, we don't emphasize media production. I believe there's actually limited sort of improvements given the cost of media production. Now, and we focus on what actually matters, the quality of the learning, and whatever tools, so the Scholar package, we've just moved to the Scholar 2.0 package. We're using a completely new set of platforms, but the principles are the same. So that's what I would point to. Having said that, you can't neglect the question of platforms, and so there, we we do have some ideas about how you select, and actually what are the skills that will outlast a specific choice of platform, and how you basically, how you figure out what is the best tool at a point in time, how you adopt it, how you test it to make sure, figure out how it's different from the previous tool that you used. That's a core skill set that we're hoping to teach. And also for an organization, if you're an organization, we've seen this recently, has just invested millions of dollars in the learning management system, no matter how bad it is, it's going to be difficult to convince, to persuade people to move to something else. So we're well aware of that, and that's why we have actually an entire module on specifically on the platforms. All right, from Mai Warren, who has an erratic connection, and I'm sorry about that, but it's part of life now. Who says, what I did here has been very interesting. Thank you. Thank you as well. Will you send out a recording? Yes, indeed. And that's certainly one of the reasons. So what would you recommend to a company building a learning management tool? What key element do they need to keep in mind to be relevant? I'm assuming, maybe, Edis, that you are one of those companies. That's a good question. Yeah, I think, so it's difficult because if you are an e-learning company, the best way that you can make money is by selling media production. Or that, at least for some companies, that's certainly been important, and I don't think that's where things are going at all. Away from content, away from sort of media, and instead on the facilitation skills, on sort of helping organizations navigate change, and maybe figuring out like how that learning management tool can serve those needs of a constantly changing environment. Maybe. Mai Warren, so I'm taking these questions, and you can actually vote for the questions. Actually, you can't, because apologies. So can you please expand more on your statement about increasing reluctance to fund training due to poor return on investment? Many humanitarian agencies currently rely on external funding for training. So yeah, I can't claim to know for every industry or every corner of humanitarian global health and development, but certainly there seems to be a frustration amongst some donors that basically they have made significant investments in learning, education, and training, and have seen nothing come out of it. And so the temptation is to throw out the baby with the bathwater and say we don't no longer fund capacity building or training at all. And I think that's a strategic mistake, because if you look at any plan coming from these organizations, they all involve developing people and capabilities. So again, I think that's one of the things we could explore in the financing module, but really putting that question on the table: who pays for it, how, and actually why is also important as well. Another question from Ibietis. Thank you for these great questions. Do you think creating alumni communities in school, K through 12, could be relevant for better outcomes of learning for pupils at school? That's an interesting question. So actually the CG Scholar platform that we use, that was developed by Bill Cope at the University of Illinois College of Education, started with 5th graders. We've been using it for adult learning, and a lot of these outcomes have been achieved using this particular platform. So I think the dynamics are relevant. Again, K through 12 is not the area where I can use, claim to know. But if I think there is a sort of continuum of learning, and yeah, it's an interesting question. What does an alumni of people who are children in school together look like? What does that alumni community look like? I think that'd be an interesting one to think about, and I'd be very interested to hear if there are experiences out there. From a question about whether at the end of this we're going to have a certificate. Sorry, we do not. The question is, what would we be certifying other than attendance? And what would be the value of that? We don't know if to what extent any participant has been listening or not. So certification usually requires some kind of assessment. So that is my answer there for the person who asked that question. Julie wants to know, do you consider that marketing, research, business strategy should be part of the skill set of a learning manager? Absolutely. I think that if you're a learning manager and you're not thinking about those things, perhaps because your institution is already has systems to take care of those things for you, you're likely to be in for a surprise at some point. And so I'm not saying you're going, that each of us needs to become like a sort of education financing specialist, but you should know enough to understand how, at least in your organization, those dots are connected to each other, and where the risks are for yourself, for your team, for the people that you serve, whether they're staff or people that the organization is trying to address. From Barbara A. Brown, another digital scholar alumnus who's been an inspiration, who's very involved in all kinds of social change in the United States. Hello, Barbara. I keep thinking of how to inspire people to want to learn more and more. I find so much need and not much desire. Yeah, I think that, yeah, I'm not sure, thank you for that comment. I'm not sure what answer I could give other than to acknowledge that I share the observation in some context, but I know also, having experienced examples of situations where in the most dire of circumstances, where people were facing tremendous challenge, and there was still that yearning to learn and change. So we know it's possible. Figuring out how to actually foster that, sort of make enough sparks to start making a fire, I think that's the role we can play in these changing times. That as educators, we're not just there to organize, deliver trainings, but that actually we can help shape change. We can help foster change. We can help accompany it as we go. From Hamed, thank you, dear Reda. My country is one of war-affected countries in the world. I hope during this course we'll learn new ways and some solutions on improving the current health system in my country. So just to clarify, the Digital Scholar program that we're preparing is not about the health system. It is really about the capacity building. So if you are a health educator working in a hospital or in the Ministry of Health, and you're responsible for the design, delivery, funding of training, and in some way evaluation of training, this may have relevance for you. Otherwise, it's I thank you, because you've probably ended up in this session because of our global health work, and I thank you for expressing your interest here. All right, I'm almost through all the questions, and I want to honor them and try to do justice to them. I apologize, I have to be so quick in my responses. All of these would warrant a much fuller discussion, and would be fascinating to hear from other perspectives and other voices. From Sohini, in places where we are only beginning to use digital learning, do you plan to build something on commonly seen challenges in using technology for knowledge dissemination and how to overcome them? Yes, I think that is something that you could gain from this program. Really thinking through the change process, thinking through the context, what's actually possible, what's going to make sense to people, analyzing the culture. So culture in the broad sense of people's openness and willingness to change, the connection between learning culture and performance, if that is what you are interested in. So yes, absolutely. How are the solutions you're working on connect together? Education stakeholders, learners, schools, employers, education sponsors. How do you achieve linking, acquiring knowledge, and applying knowledge at work? So very quickly, that's a very good question. The Impact Accelerator model is how we have come to, it is something that we co-designed with participants. Some of them are also in this room. So I want to say hello to the immunization scholars who have done so much, where we figured out once you've done a course, if it uses project-based learning, problem-based learning in some way, people have built an action plan. And then the next question is, well, do you think you can actually do something with that action plan or not? And that's what that's why we built this model for the Impact Accelerator. Again, that's something that we would, we will be sharing in more detail, and would be pleased to partner with an organization interested in thinking of learning beyond training and thinking about that continuum from learning, knowledge to action, and ultimately to impact. So is the program relevant for students, or is it only primarily for educators? I think it's primarily for educators, but I mean, part of the vision is that learners can be teachers, and teachers are also have much to learn, but in practice, I think this program will make the most sense to people who are actually involved in design, analysis, facilitation, financing, leadership, platforms. Just a word about the apprenticeship and partnership parts. So this would be for people who've completed the modules, and basically we have programs that are running all the time. So we would be providing opportunities to join sort of hands-on and actually help us make these programs, and that's one of the most effective ways, as I think many people in the room know, to go. And for Abubakar Shuaibu, who asks, can I leave now? Yes, of course, Abubakar. There's no obligation. I decided that it would be worth going over time to honor the questions, the many questions that are being asked. All right. So is it the kind of skills you will enhance? Yes. So Julie, I'm not sure what kind of skills you're asking about. The cost to participate in the program, we don't know yet. We're looking for cost contributions from organizations interested in, that see the value of this. We, of course, have as part of our mission, we want it to be credential. We want the credential to have real value. So it won't be free, and we want we want to open up access so many people can participate. So we're thinking of various kinds of sponsorship and sort of co-funding models for that. We'll be announcing that once we've finished consulting with partners and contributors to the program. All right, it looks like there's a few more questions that I would love to take on, but it's already 15 minutes. We're already 15 minutes over time. So I'm going to bring this session to a close and warmly thank all of you who attended. We had over 350 people register. So this is impressive attendance today. Thank you. I honestly was not sure that with everything we put into the page presenting this event, that it would just necessarily, that it might do something other than confuse people. So if you're here, I am truly grateful and look forward to further engagement, further dialogue, and certainly open to continuing this this conversation. Once again, warm thank you and goodbye.